Woman delivers a baby that looks like an alien. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The room was heavy with a stillness that felt unnatural. The kind of stillness that comes right before a storm. Sarah lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and drenched with sweat, but a small smile tugged at her lips as she stared at the bundle in her arms. A white hospital blanket was wrapped snugly around her newborn, but its face peeked out, soft, fragile, and unfamiliar. A nurse stood nearby, her hands trembling as she clutched a clipboard close to her chest. Her wide eyes darted back and forth between the baby and Sarah as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. The sound of the monitor's steady beeps was the only thing breaking the silence. Sarah blinked up at her, confused. "Is my baby okay?" Her voice was soft and weak, strained from hours of labor, but it carried an edge of concern. The nurse didn't answer immediately. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, her face pale as though she were trying to decide what words to use. Finally, after a few stuttering breaths, she managed, I need to get the doctor." She turned on her heel and hurried out of the room, her footsteps sharp and frantic against the tile floor. Sarah furrowed her brow as she looked back down at the baby in her arms. "What was that about?" she murmured softly, though the question was more for herself than anyone else. Her baby stared up at her with wide, unblinking eyes that were impossibly large for its face. Deep black, glossy like polished glass, and eerily reflective. The baby was silent, completely calm, and as Sarah studied its features, she noticed other things. Its skin, though delicate and smooth, had a faint gray-green tint. Not unhealthy, but distinctly unnatural. Its limbs were thin, almost too thin, poking out from the blanket with small fingers that curled like tiny twigs. There was a slight elongation to its head, not deformed, but different. Unique. Sarah swallowed hard, a strange unease settling into her chest. She knew babies could look odd when they were first born. The stress of delivery often left their heads misshapen, their features swollen. But this was something else. "It's okay," she whispered, almost as if to reassure herself as much as the baby. She shifted her grip slightly, pressing a gentle kiss against its forehead. The skin there felt cool to the touch, almost soothing, like the surface of a smooth stone left in the shade. The baby made no noise, didn't cry or squirm as most newborns did. It simply watched her, its eyes unblinking, unmoving, as though it were studying her just as intently. The door to the room opened again, and the doctor entered with hurried steps. Dr. Reynolds was a tall man in his late 40s, with a thick head of salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. He moved to Sarah's bedside quickly, pulling on a pair of gloves. The nurse followed behind him, her face still pale, though she now tried to hide her nerves behind a professional mask. "Sarah," Dr. Reynolds said gently, glancing briefly at the baby before forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" Sarah hesitated. "Tired. But I'm okay." Her voice wavered. She could tell something was wrong. Why else would the doctor look at her that way? Good. He nodded, but there was something off about his tone. "And the baby?" "She's fine," Sarah replied, though the words didn't feel quite right. Was the baby fine? It wasn't crying, it wasn't fussing. It wasn't even blinking. She adjusted her hold again, shifting the blanket so the baby's face was in full view. Dr. Reynolds froze for a fraction of a second. The pause was subtle, but Sarah noticed it. The doctor's face remained calm, composed, but his eyes betrayed him. They widened ever so slightly before darting back to meet Sarah's gaze. "May I take a look?" he asked, extending his hands slowly. Sarah hesitated. Something inside her screamed no, an instinctual, primal urge to protect her child from whatever this was. But she couldn't explain that feeling, not even to herself. With a reluctant nod, she handed the baby over. Dr. Reynolds held the baby gently, his gloved hands supporting its head and back. He brought it close, peering at its face with a practiced eye, though his professional demeanor was cracking with every passing second. He turned to the nurse. "Prepare for a full neonatal exam. We need to run tests." "Tests?" Sarah repeated sharply, sitting up as best she could. "What kind of tests?" What's wrong with her? Nothing, Dr. Reynolds said quickly, his voice too calm. It's just routine. You're lying. Sarah's voice cracked, her hands shaking as she reached for the baby. Give her back. The doctor hesitated before carefully returning the baby to Sarah's arms. I promise, Sarah, it's just to make sure everything's okay. She's unique, and we want to understand why. The word unique echoed in Sarah's mind like a drumbeat. She looked down at her child again, who was still staring up at her with those impossibly large eyes, its tiny mouth set in a neutral line. It wasn't breathing heavily, wasn't fussing or reacting to any of the tension in the room. Its calmness unsettled her more than she cared to admit. I don't want her taken away, Sarah said softly, her voice firm despite the quiver. No one is taking her anywhere, Dr. Reynolds assured her, though the look he shared with the nurse told another story entirely. Let's just take it one step at a time. Hours passed. The hospital room grew darker as the afternoon light faded, casting long shadows across the walls. Sarah's baby lay bundled in her arms, still and silent, as Sarah stared at the ceiling, lost in thought. She didn't know how much time had passed before the door creaked open again. John walked in, his footsteps slow and uncertain, his eyes darting nervously toward the bundle in her arms. Hey, he said softly. Sarah looked over at him and tried to smile, though she could tell by the stiffness in his shoulders that something was wrong. You're here. Of course I'm here. He moved to sit in the chair beside her bed, though he didn't lean in to get a closer look at the baby. Instead, he kept his distance, his gaze fixed on Sarah's face. How are you feeling? Tired? Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket around the baby. But, do you want to hold her? John hesitated, his expression darkening for just a moment before he forced a smile. Sure. Yeah. He reached out with stiff hands, and Sarah gently placed the baby into his arms. As soon as he looked down at the baby's face, his breath hitched. Sarah didn't miss the way his eyes widened, how his jaw tightened as he fought to keep his expression neutral. What do you think? Sarah asked softly, though her voice carried an edge of tension. John didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered to hers before darting back to the baby. She's something, isn't she? Something. The words sat heavily in the air between them. Sarah's chest tightened. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, John said quickly, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. He shifted the baby back towards Sarah, almost too quickly, as though her weight had burned him. I don't know, Sarah. This isn't normal. She's our daughter, Sarah snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. What's not normal about that? John rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her gaze. Her face. Tries. Sarah, you have to see it. You have to know this isn't, right? Sarah's fingers curled tightly around the baby's blanket. She's fine. She's not fine, John shot back, his voice rising. Look at her. Babies don't look like that, Sarah. They don't stare like that, they don't. He cut himself off, shaking his head. Get out, Sarah said quietly. John froze. What? Get out? Her voice trembled as she pulled the baby closer to her chest, shielding her from John's gaze. If you can't accept her, then leave. Sarah, listen to me. Get. For a moment, John just stood there, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her baby once again. The door clicked softly behind John as he left, but the silence that followed felt like a slap to Sarah's face. She clutched the baby tighter against her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry now. Not while her child, her daughter, lay so still and silent in her arms. It's okay, Sarah whispered into the dim room, her voice shaky. It's just you and me now. We're okay. The baby didn't respond, didn't make a sound. Her large, glassy eyes were still fixed on Sarah's face, studying her. For the first time, Sarah felt an odd, inexplicable comfort in that stare. There was something about those eyes, as unnatural as they were, that calmed her racing thoughts. It was as if the baby could see her, really see her, in a way no one else could. I'll protect you, Sarah murmured, smoothing the blanket around the baby's small body. Her voice was steadier now, more resolute. No one's going to take you away. A faint knock broke through her thoughts, and Sarah's head snapped toward the door. Before she could say anything, it opened, and Dr. Reynolds stepped inside. He wasn't alone this time. 2 other people followed close behind. One was a woman in a neat suit, her face cold and unreadable. The other was a man with a clipboard, wearing thick glasses that caught the glare of the fluorescent light overhead. Neither of them looked like they belonged in a hospital room. "Sarah," Dr. Reynolds began, his voice slow and careful, "I know you've had a long day, but we need to speak with you about your baby." Sarah tensed immediately. Knowing her arms instinctively curled protectively around the bundle in her lap. "She's fine. You don't need to run any tests. Please, just listen," Dr. Reynolds said, holding up a hand as if to calm her. "These are specialists. They're here to help us understand what's happening." "What's happening?" Sarah's voice rose sharply, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Nothing is happening. She's my daughter. That's all you need to know." The woman in the suit stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tile floor. "Ms. Harper," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. "My name is Dr. Callahan. I work with a special branch of medical research that deals with rare cases like this." "Cases?" Sarah spat, the word like poison in her mouth. "She's not a case. She's a baby. My baby." Dr. Callahan's expression didn't change. She pulled a tablet from the leather folder under her arm and swiped at the screen before holding it out for Sarah to see. "This is a preliminary scan we conducted earlier," she explained. "It shows some unusual markers in your daughter's biology. Markers we've never seen before." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering down to the glowing screen. A colorful image filled the tablet, a swirling mix of red and blue, like a heat map. In the center was the faint outline of a baby, but something was wrong. Strange patterns rippled through the scan, shapes and colors that didn't look natural. They pulsed faintly, like energy caught on film. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "We don't know yet," Dr. Callahan admitted. "But we need to find out. This could be groundbreaking, Ms. Harper. Your baby, your daughter, may be the key to understanding something completely unprecedented in medical science." "You mean something wrong with her?" Sarah said bitterly, glaring at the woman. "You think she's sick? Or dangerous?" "We don't know what she is," Dr. Callahan replied coolly, "and that's precisely the point. We need to study her so we can understand." "No," Sarah's voice was hard, final. "You're not touching her." Dr. Reynolds stepped forward again, his expression gentle but pleading. "Sarah, please try to see it from our perspective. This isn't normal. Her appearance, her silence, these are signs that something's different. If we can understand it, maybe we can help her. Maybe we can help you." "I don't need help," Sarah snapped. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her breaths shallow. "And she doesn't either. She's not some experiment for you to poke and prod. She's mine." Dr. Callahan's face darkened slightly. "Ms. Harper, I understand this is overwhelming, but we're not asking. The hospital is required to report cases like this to the proper authorities. If you don't cooperate, this will escalate beyond your control." Sarah's blood ran cold. "The authorities?" she echoed faintly. "You're saying you'll take her from me?" "We're saying we need to make sure she's safe," Dr. Callahan replied, though her tone lacked any warmth. "And that you're safe." The air seemed to thicken around Sarah, pressing in on her chest. She looked down at the baby in her arms, her tiny, grayish face still calm, still watching her. For the first time, Sarah noticed something in those black eyes, something she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was knowing, understanding. "No," Sarah said again, her voice a low growl. "You're not taking her." Dr. Callahan opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the baby moved. It was a small motion, barely more than a twitch, but it made Sarah freeze. The baby's tiny hand lifted from the blanket, its thin fingers stretching toward Sarah's face. And then, softly, it touched her cheek. A jolt shot through Sarah's body, like an electric current buzzing just beneath her skin. She gasped, her eyes going wide as her mind suddenly filled with images, flashes of light, swirling colors, vast landscapes that stretched out beneath skies she'd never seen before. Her chest tightened, And for a brief moment, she felt weightless, as if she were floating in some endless, empty space. And then it was over. The baby's hand fell away, its fingers curling back into the blanket. Sarah slumped against the pillows, her breaths coming in short, shaky gasps. The room was silent. The doctor and the specialist stared at her, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. "Sarah?" Dr. Reynolds said cautiously, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" Sarah blinked, her eyes still wide and glassy. She looked down at the baby in her arms, her heart pounding in her ears. The images were fading now, like a dream slipping through her fingers, but one thing was clear: this child was not ordinary. She wasn't sick. She wasn't wrong. She was something else. "I want you to leave," Sarah said hoarsely, her voice shaking. "No." Dr. Callahan frowned. "Ms. Harper, get out." Sarah's voice cracked as she shouted, her grip tightening on the baby. The monitor beside her bed began to beep wildly, the sound sharp and frantic in the otherwise quiet room. Dr. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Dr. Callahan before nodding slowly. "We'll give you some time," he said carefully, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "But Sarah, this isn't over. We'll need to revisit this." Sarah didn't respond. She kept her eyes locked on the baby, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. The doctors turned and left the room, the door closing behind them with a soft click. For several long moments, Sarah sat frozen, staring down at her child. The baby stared back, its dark, glassy eyes unblinking, unafraid. "What are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't expect an answer. But in those eyes, those impossibly deep, knowing eyes, she felt the faintest trace of something that sent a shiver down her spine. Recognition. The hospital room was quiet again, but the stillness felt different now, charged, electric. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted the blanket around her baby. Her breaths were uneven, her mind still reeling from the visions. Those images, otherworldly landscapes, impossible skies, had felt too real to be her imagination. They lingered at the edges of her thoughts like faint shadows, refusing to fade completely. She looked down at the baby. The child's face was calm, those dark eyes still fixed on her as though they were silently sharing a secret. "What did you show me?" Sarah whispered, her voice quivering. She brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead and swallowed hard. Her body still buzzed with the strange energy she'd felt when the baby touched her. It was like she had been shown something important, but she couldn't grasp it. Not yet. A knock at the door made her jump. It was soft, hesitant, but enough to send a fresh wave of panic through her veins. She turned her head sharply, clutching the baby tighter against her chest. "Sarah?" The voice belonged to a nurse. "I just need to check your vitals." "No," Sarah said quickly, her voice cracking. "I'm fine. Are you sure?" The nurse's tone was polite, but Sarah could hear the doubt in her voice. "It'll just take a minute." "No," Sarah repeated louder this time. "Please, just leave me alone." There was a pause. Then, the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. Sarah exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging with relief. But she knew that relief wouldn't last long. They wouldn't leave her alone forever. Dr. Callahan had made that clear. They'll take her away. The thought hit her like a punch to the stomach, stealing the air from her lungs. She had seen the way they looked at her baby, as though she was something to be studied, dissected. They didn't see her as a child. They saw her as evidence. And Sarah couldn't let that happen. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket as she made her decision. She had to leave. She had to get out of this hospital and take her baby somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't find her. Her heart pounded as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her body protesting with sharp stabs of pain. She ignored it. She couldn't afford to stop. Carefully, she stood, holding the baby close to her chest. The hospital gown felt flimsy and cold against her skin, but she didn't have time to change. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the closet in the corner. A plastic bag sat inside, her personal belongings, delivered earlier by John. Her throat tightened as she thought of him. His face when he'd looked at their child, horrified, almost disgusted, flashed in her mind. She had hoped he would understand, that he would stand by her, but now she was alone. Completely alone. Except for the baby. She crossed the room quickly, retrieving the bag and pulling out her clothes. It wasn't much, a pair of jeans, a soft sweatshirt, her shoes, but it would do. She struggled to dress with one hand, refusing to put the baby down. Every second that passed felt like a countdown. Any moment now, someone would come back. They'd take her baby. No, she muttered to herself, shaking her head. Not happening. When she was dressed, she pulled the baby closer, adjusting the blanket to keep her small face hidden. Then she moved to the window. The sun had set, and the view outside was cloaked in shadows. The parking lot below was sparsely lit, the occasional car passing through the darkness. The hospital's back entrance was nearby, a small, staff-only exit that she'd noticed when she first arrived. Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the door, half expecting someone to burst in at any moment. But the hallway outside was still quiet. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the window and pushed it open. A cold gust of air hit her face, making her shiver, but she didn't care. She scanned the area below. It wasn't too far of a drop. The ground was soft with grass. She could do this. It's just you and me now, she whispered to the baby, kissing her forehead softly. We'll be okay. Carefully, she climbed onto the windowsill, holding the baby tightly against her chest. Her heart raced as she swung her legs out and braced herself. For a split second, she hesitated, fear freezing her in place. But then she looked down at her daughter, and the fear melted away. With a deep breath, she jumped. The landing was rough. Her knees buckled as her feet hit the ground, and she stumbled forward, barely managing to keep her balance. Pain shot up her legs, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to move. There was no time to waste. She glanced up at the window she had come from, half expecting to see someone peering down at her, but the room was empty. She turned and hurried toward the back of the hospital. The baby stayed silent in her arms, her small body warm and still. It was as though she understood what was happening, as though she knew this was life or death. By the time Sarah reached the edge of the parking lot, her lungs burned and her muscles ached. She ducked behind a row of bushes, pressing her back against the rough brick wall. She needed a plan. She couldn't just wander out onto the street. They'd be looking for her soon. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look. Her parents' house. The thought came out of nowhere, but it made sense. The house she grew up in was far from here, nestled on the outskirts of a small town surrounded by woods. Her parents had passed away years ago, but the house had been left to her. It was empty, quiet. She just needed a way to get there. She scanned the parking lot again, her eyes landing on an old blue sedan parked near the staff entrance. A man in scrubs was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette and scrolling through his phone. Sarah's stomach twisted as she realized what she had to do. "I'm sorry," she whispered under her breath. She pulled the hood of her sweatshirt up over her head, shielding her face as much as possible. Then she stepped out from the bushes and approached the man quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man looked up, startled. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, with messy brown hair and tired eyes. Hey," he said, blinking at her. "Are you okay? You're not supposed to be out here." "I know," Sarah said quickly. She tightened her grip on the baby, who remained silent and still. I need help. Please. It's an emergency." The man frowned, straightening up. "What kind of emergency?" Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. "My car broke down," she lied. "And I need to get to my parents' house. My baby, she's sick. I need to get her somewhere safe." The man's expression softened as he looked at the small bundle in Sarah's arms. "Sick? Do you need me to call someone?" "No," Sarah said quickly, panic rising in her chest. "No, please, I need a ride. I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't have anyone else to call." The man hesitated, clearly torn. He looked down at his phone, then back at Sarah. Finally, he sighed and nodded. He said, "I can give you a ride. But just to your parents' place, okay? I'm supposed to be working." Relief flooded through Sarah's body. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you so much." Yeah, the man muttered, flicking his cigarette away and opening the car door. Let's just hurry up. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, cradling the baby against her chest as the man started the engine. The car rumbled to life, and Sarah's heart began to settle for the first time in hours. They were leaving. They were getting away. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Sarah glanced down at the baby. Her small face was calm, her eyes closed as though she were sleeping. Sarah reached out and touched her cheek gently, feeling the coolness of her skin. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're safe now." But as the hospital faded into the distance, a faint unease tugged at the back of Sarah's mind. The baby's silence, her stillness, the strange visions, none of it made sense. And deep down, Sarah knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hum of the car's engine filled the silence as they drove down the empty highway. The night was dark, and the pale glow of the headlights stretched out ahead, illuminating the road but nothing beyond it. Trees lined both sides like silent sentinels, their shadows swaying faintly in the breeze. Sarah sat stiffly in the passenger seat, the baby nestled in her arms. She kept her head turned toward the window, watching the darkness roll past, but her mind was a tangled mess. Every few seconds, she glanced down at her daughter. The baby was still calm, her small face serene, as though the chaos of the past hours hadn't touched her at all. "Where's your parents' place?" the man driving asked, breaking the silence. His voice was casual, but Sarah could sense the tension beneath it. "About 2 hours from here," she replied quietly. "It's near a small town called Pine Hollow." The man nodded, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. "I've heard of it. Real quiet out there. Why are you going so far? Wouldn't the hospital be better for her if she's sick?" "She's not sick," Sarah said quickly, her voice sharper than she'd intended. The man glanced at her briefly, surprised by her tone. She sighed and softened her voice. I need to get away for a while. Somewhere safe." The man didn't press further, but the look on his face told Sarah he thought she was running from something. He wasn't wrong. She just couldn't explain it. For a while, neither of them spoke. The road stretched on endlessly, the hum of the tires on asphalt like a low, constant murmur. Sarah tightened the blanket around the baby, her thumb brushing gently against her daughter's cool cheek. "What are you?" she whispered under her breath, so softly that the driver couldn't hear. The baby didn't react, didn't blink. Sarah couldn't decide if that comforted her or terrified her. The sedan pulled up to the small house at the edge of Pine Hollow just past midnight. The house sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by trees that loomed over the property like dark giants. The windows were dark, the house silent, as though it had been asleep for years. "This is it?" the man asked, frowning as he peered through the windshield. "Yeah," Sarah murmured. She didn't have the energy to explain. To him, it probably looked like the kind of place people avoided, abandoned, forgotten. To her, it was home. Or at least it had been. The man killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt deafening. "You sure you're good here?" he asked. "I can wait if you—" "No," Sarah said quickly, shaking her head. "We'll be fine. Thank you." He shrugged, clearly relieved, and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Suit yourself. Let me help you with your stuff." "I've got it," Sarah said firmly. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air, holding the baby close to her chest. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint chill that bit at her skin. She didn't care. She just needed to get inside. The man didn't argue. He leaned against the car for a moment, lighting another cigarette and watching her with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he said finally. "And whatever's going on with the kid, I hope it works out." Sarah hesitated, looking back at him. For a brief moment, she considered explaining everything: the baby's strange silence, the hospital, the visions. But what would she even say? He wouldn't believe her. No one would. "Thanks," she said softly before turning away. She walked quickly up the path toward the house, the gravel crunching under her shoes. The baby was still silent, her small body warm against Sarah's chest. The house loomed ahead, dark and empty, but it felt like a refuge, a place where no one could find them. Sarah fumbled with the keys as she reached the front door, her hands trembling. Finally, the lock clicked, and she pushed the door open. The air inside was stale and cold, but it smelled familiar. Dust and wood mixed with something faintly sweet, like the memory of old flowers. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, flipping the deadbolt. For a moment, she just stood there, her chest rising and falling with deep, shaky breaths. "We're safe," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it for the baby or herself. The house was exactly as she remembered it. The living room still held the same threadbare couch her parents had owned for years, the coffee table still covered in faint rings left behind by forgotten mugs. A family photo hung on the wall, the edges yellowed with age. She stared at it for a moment. Her parents' faces smiled back at her, frozen in time. Her father's arm was wrapped protectively around her mother, and a younger Sarah stood in front of them, her gap-toothed grin full of innocence. "I wish you were here," she whispered to the photo. The baby stirred slightly in her arms, breaking Sarah's reverie. She looked down and saw those familiar black eyes staring up at her again, unblinking, curious, knowing. Sarah sighed and moved toward the small bedroom at the back of the house. It was cold, the air biting at her skin, but it was better than the hospital. She set the baby down gently on the bed, propping her up with the pillow. The child didn't cry, didn't fuss. She just watched Sarah, her gaze following every movement. Sarah sat down beside her, exhaustion settling into her bones. Her body ached, her mind swirled with too many thoughts, but she couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. She just stared at the baby, her baby, and tried to make sense of everything. "I don't know what you are," Sarah murmured softly, brushing her fingers against the baby's small hand. "But I know you're mine. I don't care what they say. I don't care what they think. You're mine and I'll protect you." The baby didn't respond. Sarah didn't expect her to. But as she sat there, the tension in her chest began to ease. For the first time all day, she felt a flicker of calm, a small, fragile sense of peace. The peace didn't last. Sarah woke with a start sometime later, the room bathed in faint moonlight. She didn't remember falling asleep, but the ache in her neck told her she'd been out for a while. The baby still lay beside her, wrapped in the blanket, her face turned toward the window. Sarah rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep, when she noticed something. The room felt wrong. She sat up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. The air was colder now, so cold that she could see her breath misting faintly in front of her face. She glanced at the window, expecting to see it open, but it was closed. The wind outside had stopped, and the silence was deafening. And then she heard it. A low, faint humming sound, just at the edge of her hearing. It was distant, like the vibration of power lines or the soft whine of electronics, but it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Sarah's eyes darted to the baby. Her daughter was still, her large black eyes staring blankly out toward the window, unblinking. The hum seemed to grow louder, and for a moment, Sarah swore she saw the faintest glow outside, a pale light filtering in through the edges of the curtains. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The baby didn't react. Sarah's chest tightened as the humming grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the house like some kind of pulse. She stood quickly, scooping the baby into her arms. Her mind raced, panic setting in. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. She hurried to the window, pulling the curtain aside with trembling fingers. What she saw made her blood run cold. A light, brilliant and pale, like a spotlight, shone down from above. It was coming from somewhere in the sky, though Sarah couldn't see its source. It bathed the yard in an eerie glow, turning the grass a ghostly white. The trees around the house seemed frozen, their leaves still as though time itself had stopped. Sarah stumbled back from the window, clutching the baby tightly against her chest. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The humming grew louder still, rattling the windows and shaking the floor beneath her feet. Sarah's breaths came in short gasps as she backed toward the door, her mind screaming at her to run. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The light vanished, leaving the room in darkness once again. The silence that followed was so complete it felt suffocating. Sarah stood frozen in place, her body trembling, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. The baby made a small sound then, A soft, almost musical coo. Sarah looked down, her heart still racing. Her daughter's face was calm, her eyes bright and unblinking as they stared up at Sarah. "What is happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. The baby didn't answer. But in her eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. The faintest flicker of recognition. Sarah didn't sleep after that. She couldn't. Her body trembled with the aftershocks of what she'd just seen, her thoughts tangled like a knot she couldn't undo. The light, the sound, what had it been? A plane? A helicopter? Nothing she knew could explain it. And the baby, her baby, had been calm through it all, as if she understood something Sarah didn't. The baby stirred softly in her arms, breaking the silence. Sarah looked down, brushing her hand over the child's smooth, cool cheek. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happening to us?" She didn't expect an answer. And yet, as she gazed into those impossibly black eyes, she felt it again. A faint hum, not in the air but somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, like the echo of a heartbeat reverberating in her chest. It was subtle but undeniable. The baby was calm because all of this, was normal for her. But not for Sarah. Her breath hitched as she sat back on the edge of the bed, hugging the baby closer to her chest. She could still see the pale glow outside, burned into her mind like an afterimage. The silence that followed had been unnatural, too complete, too deliberate. Something had been there, and whatever it was, it had been looking for them. For her baby. Sarah's heart pounded harder as a terrifying thought crept in. What if they had followed her here? What if she hadn't escaped the hospital at all, but had led something, or someone, straight to them? She stood abruptly, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The house felt even colder now, as though something had seeped into its walls, into the very air. Sarah scanned the room, her muscles tense, listening for any sound beyond the beat of her own heart. The baby stayed quiet, unmoving, her small face serene against the blanket. "I have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "We can't stay." But where would they go? She had no car, no money. The small town of Pine Hollow was miles from the nearest bus station, and even if she made it that far, where could they hide? No matter how far she ran, Sarah felt certain that whatever is, would find them. A creaking sound echoed through the house. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned her head sharply toward the hallway outside the bedroom. The sound was faint, like a floorboard groaning under weight. For a long moment, the silence returned, thick and suffocating. Then it came again, louder this time, closer. Someone, or something, was in the house. Her heart leapt into her throat as adrenaline surged through her veins. She spun around, searching the dark room for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. Her eyes landed on an old brass lamp sitting on the nightstand. She grabbed it with her free hand, her grip tight enough to make her knuckles ache. The weight of the baby in her other arm was grounding, but also terrifying. How could she fight while keeping her daughter safe? The creaking grew louder, now just outside the door. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed up slowly, positioning herself between the baby and the door. The doorknob rattled once, twice, before the sound stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and expectant. Then the door opened. Sarah gasped sharply, her body going rigid as the door creaked inward, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. No figure, no movement, just emptiness. For a split second, she thought she might be imagining it. Her mind was playing tricks on her. It had to be. But then, something moved. A shadow. Small and quick, darting across the hallway beyond. Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. No response. The shadow was gone, but the feeling it left behind remained. A heavy, pressing sense of being watched. She couldn't see them, but they were there. She could feel it. The baby cooed softly then, a quiet sound that almost broke Sarah's composure entirely. She turned her gaze down to her daughter, her arms tightening protectively around her. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. "We'll be okay." She backed toward the window, her mind racing. There was no way out through the front of the house. Whoever, or whatever, was inside would find her if she tried. The window was her only option. She set the lamp down quietly, careful not to make a sound, and shifted the baby so she could pull the curtain aside. The night outside was black, but the pale moon offered just enough light to see the ground below. It wasn't far. She could make it. She had to. Taking a deep breath, Sarah unlatched the window and pushed it open. The cold air hit her like a slap, making her shiver, but she didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the sill, one leg out, the baby cradled tightly in her arms. A low hum started again. Sarah froze, her heart lurching. It wasn't loud like before. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable. The sound vibrated through her bones, filling the empty space around her. She looked back into the room, her breath catching. The shadows in the corner of the room shifted. Sarah's stomach dropped as she stared, her body frozen in place. The darkness rippled, moved, as though something within it was alive. And then, slowly, it began to take shape. A tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows, its edges blurred, its form impossible to define. It was like smoke, thick and dark, coiling as it moved toward her. Sarah didn't wait to see what it was. She shoved herself out of the window, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot up her legs as she hit the earth, but she ignored it, scrambling to her feet. The baby stayed silent, her small body still nestled safely in Sarah's arms, as though the fall hadn't disturbed her at all. Sarah stumbled away from the house, her breaths ragged and uneven. She turned back once, just long enough to see the window she'd escaped from. The shadows had returned to stillness, but the feeling remained, that cold, heavy sense of being watched. She ran. Her feet pounded against the earth as she fled through the trees, branches clawing at her arms and face. The baby didn't cry, didn't make a sound, but Sarah could feel her warmth against her chest, a small, fragile reminder of what she was running for. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The humming sound followed her, growing louder with every step. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, vibrating in her skull, rattling her bones. It was as though the earth itself was humming, shaking beneath her feet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a dirt road. She fell to her knees, her breaths coming in sharp, painful gasps. The humming had stopped. The night was silent again. Sarah clutched the baby tightly, her body trembling. Her legs ached, her hands were scraped and bleeding, but none of it mattered. She looked down at her daughter, tears blurring her vision. "We're okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We're okay now." But as she gazed into the baby's dark, unblinking eyes, she saw it again, recognition. The same quiet understanding she'd seen before. It was as though the baby knew exactly what had happened. What was happening? Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What are you?" she choked out, her voice barely more than a sob. The baby didn't respond. She simply stared up at Sarah, calm and silent. And then, from somewhere in the distance, a light appeared. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart lurching in her chest. A bright, pale light, far away but moving closer. It hovered low to the ground, weaving through the trees with unnatural precision. The humming started again, faint and distant, vibrating through the night air. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "No, not again." She pushed herself to her feet, every muscle screaming in protest, and turned to run. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. But as she stumbled forward, the light followed, growing brighter, closer, until it bathed the trees in an eerie glow. Sarah's breaths came in frantic gasps as she glanced over her shoulder. The light was almost blinding now, stretching out and swallowing the darkness. The humming grew louder, filling her head, drowning out every other sound. And then it stopped. Sarah froze, her chest heaving. The light hung in the air just behind her, blinding and unmoving. For a long, terrible moment, everything was silent. Then a voice spoke. It wasn't a voice Sarah could hear. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was a feeling deep and vibrating in her chest, like something was speaking directly to her soul. "We've come for her." Sarah's blood ran cold. The words, or whatever they were reverberated through her body like a physical blow. She staggered back, clutching the baby to her chest, her pulse hammering in her ears. The light behind her pulsed faintly, glowing brighter with each beat, as if it were alive. Watching. Waiting. We've come for her. The voice, if you could even call it that, wasn't human. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once, an overwhelming presence that pressed into Sarah's mind like a heavy fog. She couldn't see the source, but she could feel it, looming just beyond the light. Something was there, something vast and ancient and incomprehensible. And it wanted her baby. "No," Sarah choked out, her voice hoarse and trembling. "You can't have her. She's mine." The hum began again, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. The trees around her swayed without wind, their branches creaking and twisting like they were alive. The light stretched forward, spilling over Sarah in a wave of brilliance. She stumbled back further, shielding the baby with her body, but there was nowhere left to go. The road was empty, the woods dark and endless. The light swallowed everything else. "Please," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. She looked down at her daughter, whose small face was still calm, unbothered by the chaos unfolding around them. Her black eyes stared back at Sarah, wide and unblinking. And in them, Sarah saw something that made her chest ache: trust. Her daughter trusted her. Completely. The light pulsed again, and Sarah felt the hum deepen, pulling at something inside her. The baby cooed softly, lifting her tiny hand toward the light, and Sarah felt a pang of fear so sharp it nearly brought her to her knees. She knew, with a terrible certainty, that this wasn't something she could fight. It wasn't something she could run from. But she wouldn't let them take her. She couldn't. Sarah tightened her arms around the baby, her tears falling freely now. "No," she said again, her voice breaking. "You can't take her. I don't care who you are or where you came from. She's mine." The hum grew louder, shaking the very air around her, but Sarah didn't move. She planted her feet firmly on the ground, her body trembling but her resolve unshakable. The light swelled, engulfing her in a blinding glow until she couldn't see anything else. The world disappeared, swallowed whole. And then, everything stopped. The hum vanished. The light faded. The night was quiet again. Sarah blinked, her vision adjusting to the sudden darkness. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she looked around, confused. The road was empty. The trees were still. The pale glow was gone, as though it had never been there at all. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she had imagined it, if the fear and exhaustion had finally broken her. But then she felt it, a warmth in her arms. She looked down at the baby, whose small face was turned toward her, eyes wide and dark and full of understanding. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her tears falling onto the child's smooth cheek. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're okay." The baby cooed softly, a faint, almost musical sound that seemed to fill the air around them. Sarah held her close, pressing her lips gently against her daughter's forehead. The world was silent again, but the weight of what had just happened lingered like a shadow. She didn't understand it. She didn't know who or what had come for her child. But she knew one thing: they were gone. At least for now. And she had won. Sarah spent the night walking. There was no other choice. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the darkness like a lifeline. She kept her head down, her arms wrapped protectively around the baby, who remained silent in her grasp. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made Sarah flinch, but nothing appeared. The woods were still, the world quiet. Hours passed. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Sarah's legs were weak, her body screaming for rest. She stumbled as she walked, her breaths shallow and uneven, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Finally, she saw it. A small gas station at the edge of the woods, its lights flickering dimly against the morning fog. Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly knocked her over. She stumbled toward it, her shoes dragging against the gravel, and pushed through the door. A bell rang overhead, the sound sharp and jarring after the long silence. The clerk behind the counter, a tired-looking man with a scruffy beard, glanced up from his newspaper. He frowned as he took in Sarah's disheveled appearance, the dirt on her jeans, the sweat plastering her hair to her face. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked cautiously. Sarah nodded weakly, shifting the baby in her arms. "I just need to sit for a minute." The clerk hesitated, clearly unsure what to do, but then he nodded toward a small table by the window. "Go ahead. You want some water or something?" "Please," Sarah said softly. She collapsed into the chair, cradling the baby in her lap. Her limbs felt heavy, her head light, as though her body might give out completely. But the baby was safe, and that was all that mattered. She kissed her daughter's forehead gently, her fingers brushing against the soft, grayish skin. "We're okay," she murmured again, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made it." The clerk returned with a bottle of water and set it down on the table. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes red and tired. We had a rough night," she said, forcing a small, shaky smile. "But we're okay now." The clerk nodded slowly, though his expression was still laced with concern. "Well, if you need help, I can call someone." "A ride, maybe?" "No," Sarah said quickly, shaking her head. "We're fine. Thank you." The clerk hesitated again, then shrugged and walked back to the counter, leaving Sarah alone. She unscrewed the cap of the water bottle, taking a long sip before leaning back in the chair. The baby shifted slightly in her arms, her black eyes blinking up at Sarah. For the first time since the hospital, Sarah allowed herself to smile. It was small, faint, but it was real. "You're stronger than I am," she whispered, brushing her thumb against the baby's cheek. "You didn't cry once. Not through any of it. You're so much stronger than I'll ever be." The baby blinked once, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Something almost human. Almost. "You're special," Sarah said softly. "I don't know what you are, but I don't care. You're mine, and I'll protect you. No matter what." The baby cooed again, that strange, musical sound that filled the air like a gentle hum. Sarah let her head fall back against the chair, her body finally beginning to relax. The morning light streamed in through the window, warm and golden, casting a glow over the child in her arms. For the first time in days, Sarah felt at peace. Days turned into weeks. Sarah stayed at her parents' house, keeping to herself, avoiding the outside world as much as she could. She knew they were looking for her. The news had spread, reports of a woman fleeing a hospital, rumors of a strange child that no one could explain. But Pine Hollow was quiet, and no one came looking here. Not yet. The baby remained the same, silent, calm, watching. Her black eyes seemed to hold more than they should, as though she understood things Sarah could never comprehend. But Sarah didn't question it anymore. She didn't need to. Late one night, as Sarah rocked her daughter to sleep, she felt it again, that faint hum deep in her chest. It wasn't loud or overwhelming this time. It was soft, gentle, like a whisper. She looked down at her daughter, who stared back at her with those dark, knowing eyes. And in that moment, Sarah knew. "They'll come back for you one day, won't they?" she whispered. The baby blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if in answer. Sarah's throat tightened, but she forced a smile. "That's okay," she murmured, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "They won't take you until you're ready." "Until we're ready." The hum faded, and the room fell silent again. Sarah held her daughter close, rocking her gently in the darkness. Whatever the future held, whatever they were, whatever she was, it didn't matter. Because for now, they were together. And that was enough.